So just first basic question, what is your official job title?
Sure. So I'm the Deputy Executive Director for Collections and Interpretation. There are two Deputy Executive Directors. I do a lot of the mission critical stuff. The other deputy does human resources and finance.
Okay. I'll probably be asking more about that soon.
Well, I can give you a basic rundown. So we have about 30 staff across the organization in 4 locations. So there are four actual sites, 3 in Providence and 1 in Woonsocket. The one in Woonsocket is called the Museum of Work and Culture. I don't know if you have much background you've done on the historical.
We were supposed to go visit there as a class because we do trips. So, gosh, it was probably 6 weeks ago at this point now. We were at the John Brown House and talking with Geraldine. So I talked to her last week.
Okay.
Got some general sense, but.
Right. So I am Geraldine's boss.
Okay. All right.
Run the John Brown House, the research library, and my office is in the Aldrich House, which is the administrative center, I guess, headquarters. So I work with, the director, the executive director, Dr. Morgan Graff, and I work with the fundraising folks and the communications folks. I make sure that the library and the education center and the museum, I'm supposed to make sure that they all adhere to our vision and mission. And I make sure they get what they need. I try to, and make sure they all work well together. And so that's kind of but I also involved in acquisitions and collection development, and I run the board collections committee, which approves loans to other institutions. Like, for instance, we're loaning several things to the Redwood Library. We've loaned to Smithsonian and whatever. I mean, whenever another museum or an organization wants to borrow materials from us, I take a vote from that committee and blah, blah, blah. I also convene the staff collections committee once a month to approve acquisitions, mostly gifts. We don't have a lot of money to acquire furniture and museum objects and books and manuscripts every year, but I do oversee that budget. So, and I'm a librarian by training. I'm not a museum. Museums wasn't my field. Public history wasn't my field. It was librarianship.
Okay, that's actually the next question I was going to ask you about is, what is your educational background? What did you study as an undergraduate and graduate student? Like, how did you get to where you are through your education, I guess?
Sure. So I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio.
Oh,
I went to The Ohio State University for longer than I care to admit. And I went to grad school there I wanted to be an English professor. I was a huge Tolkien fan, and I wanted to be like a medievalist and whatever. And then the languages, it was too much. So, but I loved literature, and I liked history too. I probably should have been a history major. But once I got to grad school, this was in the early 90s, and it was a lot of theory, a lot of literary theory. And one of my professors he was a Renaissance guy, but his position was in the library, but he taught the bibliography course in graduate school. And he actually said, you should think about libraries. And he introduced me to the curator of books at the Lilly Library in Indiana University. Lilly Library is this massive rare book library in Indiana. And so I was looking I needed a job. I mean, I needed a profession. It was clear that I wasn't going to be an English professor. I didn't want to go to school more. And I didn't have the kind of focus that it would take to get a PhD. So I wanted to make money. I mean, student loans,
Yeah.
Crazy. So he was like, look, it's a 2-year degree, and it's basically like a union card. Once you get that degree, then that qualifies you for any library job, whether it's a children's library, making sock puppets, or an academic library, somewhere. I was like, well, that sounds good. So I went to talk to this guy, and he took me back into the stacks, and it was like Aladdin's Cave of Wonders. I mean, it was just a person. It was just outstanding. It was amazing. Saw a Gutenberg Bible, the first 4 folios of Shakespeare, the manuscript of Peter Pan, the play. I mean, just it blew my mind, just what they had. So it's like, wow, I just have to do a 2-year degree, and I get to do this. So it was like, yeah. So I went to Indiana and racked up more student loans, but my first job, and I did everything that they would let me do. It was great. So my first job was at Brown. And so when I went on the market, the John Carter Brown Library was hiring a reference librarian, and I met. So sometimes when you enter a field, you can go to a conference and meet somebody before an interview. So they sent someone to a conference in DC where the Rare Books Conference was, and I met this woman, and she and I got along really well. So she went back and said, we should interview this guy. And so they interviewed me, and I started there in '98. So I was there for 10 years, and it was a great experience. I learned a ton, and that just sort of started me on my library career. So I went from, and I could actually give you, when the Historical Society hired me, they actually ran a long bio on me, so I could actually send you a link to that. And, but I mean, this is an interview. So after 10 years of that, no one was leaving. Everybody, I mean, there was no upward movement, right? There was no way to increase salary. And so I had just gotten married, having children. So the only way to really make more money in any field or at least this field, is to move. So I went to, for 3 years, I was at the Providence Public Library. They actually paid more than Brown at that point, strangely. And then that was around 2008, 2010. And then 2010, there was a position at Trinity. And so I got basically the head curator there, the head of Rare Books. And I was there for 7.5 years. But my wife is from Newport, and we wanted to come back to Rhode Island, and we had a couple kids by then, and we came back here when this job opened up. So it's kind of how I don't know. So, I mean, does that answer your question? I think that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. So you said that when you were getting your library degree, you did whatever they let you do. So were those like internships kind of thing, or like student work jobs? Like what did you do to gain experience while you were working towards your degree?
No, that's a good question. So the curators taught classes. So I took their classes. That was one thing. So the curator of Rare Books, who basically became my mentor, taught classes in history of the book and bibliography and reference sources for Rare Books. The curator of manuscripts taught a manuscript course. And I also became a student worker there. So I was, I worked the front desk. And then a little bit further in, like the second year, I did an internship with Joel, who was my professor. during that internship, see, he had been, before he was curator there, he had been, believe it or not, a tax lawyer in California, and then he'd been a rare book dealer. So he knew the rare book trade. So he actually would take me on buying trips, or, you know, to people's houses who wanted to donate material. So there was actually a widow of a guy who worked in radio in Indiana, and in their garage there were 100,000 pieces of sheet music that this guy had collected over his whole career. And there were other places that we would go. House, you know, when you become a librarian, or at least, you know, when you get into this field, people have stuff and they want to offer it to you, and oftentimes it's more stuff than they can just bring in a box. It's a whole house, you know, or you have to kind of go and see these things. And there's also there are also rare book dealers that they come around, at least they used to, before the internet. They used to come around with a suitcase full of rare books and offer you stuff, right? And so you'd sit there, and they would bring them out, talk about them, and, you know, and so he would allow me to sit with him, and then we'd talk about it afterwards, and, you know, why he chose these things, everything. So it was really, you know, it was really an apprenticeship, and taught me a lot about kind of the unspoken etiquette of these kinds of things. You know, how to approach these people, and they're very different. I mean, some people are very pressuring. They're like, you know, I really need the money, please buy these books, you know, and some people were like, you know, take your time, you know, if you don't want the book, send it back. I mean, I'll leave it here, you know. And so to understand the kind of unwritten rules of the game was pretty important training. And it was outside of I mean, it was part of an internship, but it really wasn't part of the formalized training that one would expect. It really was above and beyond, I think. So that helped me a lot, you know.
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it helped me when I got to the John Carter Brown Library. So here I am. What training have I had? I worked at bookstores, but there were used bookstores. I wasn't used to dealing with material that cost more than $100 maybe. All of a sudden, I'm going to the New York Book Fair, where they have millions of dollars worth of books in one place, with dealers from all over the world in these little stalls, dressed to the nines. You know, some of them have, you know, wine in their booths. They're inviting me to their, you know, flat for cigars and whatever. And, you know, I mean, just like, what is this, right? And they have these books that cost more than I make every year, you know? I mean, far
crazy.
Well, here's a $250,000 book. Oh my God, I can't. How am I going to decide to spend this kind of money? How do I know, you know, how important this book is? Yeah. So it was a really interesting way to be introduced to the whole world. I mean, I definitely was just blown away. And so I had to learn a lot very quickly. So that was kind of cool. I mean, and I miss that. I miss having the money to do that. You know, because Brown, you know, I mean, at least John Carter Brown Library had, at that point, they had a fair amount of money to spend, and I couldn't. It wasn't like they gave me a blank check. I had to clear all of my purchases. You know, I did have to. You know, there was a kind of an approval process. But I was on the front line. I was out there making the choices, checking to see if we'd had stuff, talking to the dealers, and creating and having a relationship with them. So, so that was just it was just a great opportunity. Did that answer your question? I can't remember.
Yeah. Sorry about like specifically answering it. It's kind of just more
okay.
Like we're looking to hear your experiences and your story, because
right.
People in public history, from what we've talked about as a class, like, you know, they're not just your basic historians who've, you know, undergrad history degree, graduate history degree, maybe PhD. It's like these people have like such diverse experiences, and there are so many different, you know, job titles and facets of it. It's like public history doesn't explain everything that's, you know, part of it.
Yeah.
So this is really interesting.
It's I've only begun to read some of the history of public history as a field, simply because I find myself in charge of 2 museums now and in charge of people who are supposed to be like I'm a rare book librarian by trade, so it's a weird path. I was hired essentially to run the library. So the person who quit wasn't really a librarian, and when she tried to run the library, she didn't do a real good job. So when she quit, the director decided, I'm going to make sure that the next hire is someone who has some library experience, so that the staff there gets what they need. But then they decided to also put the education department. Now I have taught. So when I was at Trinity College, I was able to teach out of the graduate department in American Studies. And that was a complete snafu too, because there was a faculty member there tragically died.
Oh no.
So I know, through the semester. And the director of graduate studies, she taught a museum studies course on exhibitions. And Trinity's a small place. I mean, it's a small college. And so the director of grad studies, these poor grad students were 7 weeks into their semester and professor. And so he asked me, he was like, you're probably the only one on campus who could finish this course. Could you try? So I said, sure. And I taught before. In grad school, I taught English classes and whatever, but, and I like to teach. So I went in, and because I was the director of special collections, so I had a whole, the person who was teaching it had been a curator at the Museum of Natural History, or I think in New York. So she had a lot of connections to New York curators, and that was the practical side of her course. Well, I didn't have those connections, but I did have 200,000 rare books. So we put together in 7 weeks, each student did their own little 2-case exhibit. We produced a catalog. We had an opening event, a catered opening event, and they loved it. And so they said, wow, could you teach this again? And I was like, well, yeah, sure. So then I began teaching classes as well as having a full-time gig at Trinity. And that turned into, there was one year I taught 3 classes during the year plus a full-time job. And so I was teaching undergraduates, freshmen about rare books. It was really great. So anyway, that's all to say that, so I had some experience with education, but museum education is different, very different than academic education. And so that's a challenge for me. I got to say. And so I'm still 2.5 years in, struggling with how to, how to create a vision for, a compelling vision for this team. And most of the team members that I've got aren't historians either. They're, I think Carolyn is an archaeologist by trade.
Yeah, archaeology.
And her deputy is an English major. And yeah, so it's, there's nothing that is, normal.
Yeah,
it's
so fascinating.
Yeah. So
cool. How does you describe your job a little bit, but how does your job contribute to the Rhode Island Historical Society as a whole?
Right. So I tried to make sure that the director is free to concentrate on what she has to concentrate, which is making sure that we have enough money to pay people, making sure that we collaborate and we take our place in the topography of the state and the country, there's lots of things that she does that if she isn't able to do, we as an organization cannot, aren't sustainable. So I got to make sure that I take care of the operation, and that I also carry out her vision throughout my team. From the team's perspective, I run the budgets for those areas. So I need to understand why we need what we need and how it fits within the larger structures. I mean, it is an administrative job. It's not curatorial as much as my other jobs have been. It really is about making sure people work together. When I came on board, there was a division between collections and education, and they didn't work well together, or they didn't communicate very well. It's easy when you're in two different buildings to silo, and to lose track of the fact that other people are working. It's not just you. And so a lot of my duty was to kind of bring everybody together. And I think I've done a pretty good job. I think the team has evolved and is relying far more on each other and trusts each other far more now, just because, the communication is better and people understand each other better. And so how do you quantify that? I don't know. I mean, it's just, people get into their little lanes, and then they start thinking that what they're doing is the only thing that's happening. It has to be constantly addressed. It's not something that you can just solve by having another meeting. You really have to constantly be aware of who's doing what. Because folks will get excited about something, then they'll hair off in one direction, and then they'll promise things that the institution cannot follow up on, and they don't check in, and then all of a sudden, you got this thing going on. So some of it's that, kind of herding cats a little bit, but most of it's just trying to keep everybody's eye on the ball. And so it's interesting. So I try to make everything run well in my areas. That's try not to make too many mistakes about the promise. Because everybody, honestly, when you're in a position like this, everybody wants something. External people want your spaces, want your money, want your staff time. Internal people want your money, want your spaces, want your staff. It's like, everybody, wow, we want a partner. Yeah, you should do this. Yeah, you should collect that. And so a lot of it is just sort of trying to get everybody to manage their expectations a little bit, making sure that what we're spending staff time and money on gets us as far as we can get us along the road that we want to go. So it's kind of general, but I hope that's clear.
No, it works. Yeah. So you're mentioning the team. So are there specific people in certain positions that you work with on a regular basis, like daily or?
So my direct reports are, well, I have probably too many at this point, but the librarian at the library, the registrar, Geraldine, who's the head of education department, and then the curator of the film archivist curator.
So I think someone just talked to her yesterday from my group.
Becca.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so I hired her. That was one of my first kind of jobs, was the Historical Society had new money to make sure that we could hire a film archivist, and that's a whole new area for the society. It's a huge collection that's been lying there for decades, waiting for someone to really open it up, and they finally had the money to make this happen. And it's becoming that part of the library is actually becoming that's probably going to be the place where I need to raise the most money for, because film requires a fair amount of money to digitize and then to hold it's one thing to have computer space for a digital image. It's another thing to have it for a film file. It's 10, 50 times more space that you need for all that. So in terms of infrastructure, it's a whole new world. Books and papers, and even born digital documents, they don't take up a lot of space, but you're talking about 9 million feet of film. It's going to cost us $50,000 to digitize 100,000 feet. So 9 million is going to, I can't even, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And that's just what we've got. Now, when you start talking about acquiring more, but film is one of the most accessible mediums to people. It's a lot easier to view a film than it is to read a 19th century handwritten document.
Yeah.
Easier to understand its historical context as well. So these are the kinds of things that we have to balance, Sure, it's great to have a 16th century letter, 17th century letter of Roger Williams, but who can read it? And then who can understand what it's about? How it's important to history. You got to have almost a degree in history to figure out the context before you're even understanding what you're looking at. But with other kinds of things, it's easier. So I don't know. Is that clear?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Okay, good.
What would you say is the most challenging part of your job? And are there certain challenges that you face on a regular basis? And then how do you confront those challenges?
People. Bar none. Are the most. Everybody wants something. Many times those are the same things that everybody wants, but oftentimes they're very, very different. When you have a group of highly intelligent, quirky people working in one area, it's kind of like a little pressure cooker, right? And the other thing that, when you're talking about these places, rare book libraries too, but museums, I'm sure academic departments are the same, except academic departments, the professors aren't tied to their office 8 hours a day, right? They can leave.
Yeah.
These staffs tend to be introverts. Sometimes they're extroverts, but they're mostly introverts. They're very intelligent and they're very quirky. So to have all of them in one place, having to do things in concert with each other, and sometimes with Geraldine's group, they've got to answer to the public, right? They've got to serve the public. They've got public coming in. Whereas the librarians, they have public coming in, but honestly, they can control. They've got a reading room. You have to buzz in, So they're very different experiences. So the timeline, like for instance, when the education department wants something, they have a sense of how fast they should be able to get something. Collections has a different sense of how fast they should be asked to deliver something. So those things can start to bubble up like pressure, right? Well, she said this, and I don't know, and this, so it gets interesting after a while to try to make sure that everybody treats each other with respect and understands, that everybody has their own deadlines and priorities. That said, we're all professionals, or at least we try to be. We're all adults, so we try to help each other, and we are all on the same team. But it does get. You asked about what the challenge. Yeah, that's the most challenging. I think anybody who works with people in these places will tell you the same thing. It's people who are the most challenging things. It's not the material, and it's not the concepts. It's not the intellectual content. That kind of stays still until you can figure it out. But people are the most challenging.
Okay. On the flip side, what's your favorite part of your job, and what do you find to be the most rewarding?
To some extent, the same thing. It's great to it's great to see the successes that happen, and to know that you've been a part of that. I used to say, because I mean, it is fun to acquire great things. Not going to lie to you there. I mean, when you win something at auction that really is important, it's more about the hunt and not about the getting. Because once you get it, then you got to do something with it, and that's work. But when you get people excited about things that you've got, and they take those things and do things with them, that's cool. When I was at Trinity, I had what I called a creative fellowship program, where you could, as an undergraduate, apply for a creative fellowship, which was $1,000 to come into special collections and do something creative with the collections and produce something. And so it was really fun to see people interact with the material. And I had one gal who was a fashion major, and she looked at our 19th century magazines, and she made a dress on the designs that were in Godey's Lady's book. Those kinds of, or another student was interested in cooking. So she took historic cookbooks and tried to actually make the recipes. And then she shared the recipes or the food. Some of it was awful, but I mean, it was great. It was really interesting. And it was a challenge because, we go into a 19th century cookbook. They want things that aren't on the shelves. I mean, so those kinds of interactions with material are really great. And then there's just the things that are seems like socially responsible, like the Museum of Work and Culture, which are running programs for hearing impaired, sight impaired, and also now dementia, folks with dementia. So they're actually providing museum experiences tailored for people who have short-term memory loss.
That's interesting.
It is fascinating. Now, again, this is new frontiers for me, because this is museum work that is typical. It's a little cutting edge. I mean, I would call it cutting edge. It was certainly not traditional, and it's trying to break new ground. And it's hard to know how to evaluate your impact. But some of it doesn't really matter. It just feels good to do it. And if people are enjoying what you're doing, well, that's your impact. So anyway.
What professional resources are most important to your job? And is there something you wish existed that would help you do your job better?
Ooh, that's interesting. Professional resources that I use. Well, I will say, after 10 years at Brown, I miss the resources that Brown has, or any college, even PC, because being at a small nonprofit, and I've talked to other people at small nonprofits who get used to the kind of resources that a university has, and then they're cut off from those. They're outside the paywall after they graduate and they move on. So it would be fabulous for us to have access to the kind of research resources that Brown or even Rick, Rhode Island College or PC has. We could do our job so much better if we had those kinds of intellectual resources at our fingertips. I mean, just one example would be a subscription to the Providence Journal Archive. Providence Journal is the paper of record for Rhode Island. And, don't have the money to buy that subscription. We have it on microfilm. How much?
Yeah.
Now, professional resources. So those are resources. I guess you would call those professional resources because it really is critical. Research is critical for us to interpret. To do public history, you've got to have some resources, but in terms of personally, that's a good question. I guess, you could say management, you could say, I personally would like to have some more training in fundraising, but that's not my job. I just would like to have more of an idea of how to help fundraisers. But that's a tough one. I don't know. What was it? If I could.
Is there something you wish existed that would help you do your job better?
Right. An assistant.
I think Geraldine just said more money.
Yeah, I mean, money is okay. But I find that, first of all, there are things that money will follow good ideas. And if you can create a compelling vision and a compelling activity, the money will find you. You will find the money to support it. There's I think folks underestimate the value of sweat equity. You know what that is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically, there are things, if you're creative, there are things that you can do, and you can enlist help, and you don't necessarily need the money to do what you need to do. In fact, I think sometimes money might be an obstacle. I know that sounds strange, but
no, that makes sense.
It's it makes you lazy. It can make you a little lazy and a little entitled. Again, when I was at Brown, there is I feel a Brown bubble, right? You don't understand what you have till you're out of it, and they'll do things with locals, but mostly because they have to, or they think it's it will serve their ends, but they don't care them. I mean, it's as at least as an institution, they don't have to do that. They exist on an international level or a national level, and those are the constituencies that they really, care about. The local aspects, it's good, but the follow through is never really quite there. The commitment is really never quite there. There are several initiatives that emanated from Brown because somebody wanted to do nice things, and then they died out because it just didn't continue, and because there's no reason. So again, I think money can be a challenge. I mean, money can be an opportunity, but all opportunities on one side are challenges on the other.
Mm.
For instance, if someone came and gave us $25 million, like they said, okay, Rhode Island Historical Society, we have $25 million. What are you going to do? Well, what are we going to do? I mean, we need to know what we need. I could say, oh, well, we need a new storage facility. But does that mean then that we don't think about what we take in anymore for a while because we have the space? So all of a sudden, we just say yes to stuff, even if it's crap, because we don't have to worry about it because we have plenty of space. I think that can happen, and you can also, I mean, one of the things that I've talked about to my director was that for a while, federal money was quite available. So the education, the way that the education was done in the Historical Society, they were getting Teach for America grants and all this sort of stuff. So then educators started expecting a fair amount of money for doing stuff with us. And then all that federal money dried up, and then everybody had to do it. It then became the new normal. What do you mean you don't have any money? Well, we're not interested in doing that. So then we had to change our whole strategy in terms of our approach to trying to engage teachers and students. So, again, I think, yeah, money's great, but it's not the silver bullet a lot of people think it is.
How do you connect with other professionals in your field, and how has that influenced the work you do or changed your perceptions?
Well, I'd like to say I go to conferences, but I've never been a conference goer. I don't really like, I don't find them useful. I mean, they're useful in terms of networking, but usually that's more of an early career kind of a thing. Mm. I enjoy workshops and training. And also probably where I meet the most people are in our collaborations. Whenever we decide to collaborate with another institution, then that's a good opportunity to kind of meet other people and build something together. So I think that was the first part of your question. What was the second part of your question?
How has that influenced the work you do or changed your perceptions?
So I have never seen a partnership between two institutions that didn't rely on two people. They aren't really partnerships with institutions. They're partnerships with people in those institutions. So what will happen then, I mean, if you've been in this business a long enough time, you realize that, yes, you can start a partnership, but the sustainability of that partnership almost always relies on the people involved. And if you can't somehow build in a succession plan for that partnership, so like two people get along really well, hey, let's do something. Okay, great. We agree to this and you agree to that. Here's a perfect example that I think is interesting. The Providence Athenaeum, the curator of books there, or the curator, she's married to the head of technical services at RISD, right? That's the reason that the RISD library catalog lists Providence, the Providence Athenaeum's library catalog is hosted at RISD. It isn't because it's a great partnership between, it's simply because those two people have been married and they've been in those positions for a long time. As soon as either Rob or Kate leave then you'll see how long that lasts. Will it still make sense for the Athenaeum to have their books hosted there? Will RISD continue to support that? I don't know. I mean, but I'm willing to bet it won't last long. That somebody somewhere will say, you know what, why are we doing this? Oh, okay, let's stop. So I think that's mostly just experience. And that's not to say you shouldn't have partnerships, but it is to say that sometimes when a beginning partnership happens, everybody's like, oh yeah, we're going to do this forever, or it's going to be like, in the foreseeable future. Realize that it's probably going to be a limited amount of time. So make sure that the goals you set are for the realistic time horizon. You're not saying, well, 50 years from now, we're going to have so-and-so. Like, I don't know. That'd be nice, but anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
And then last question, what advice would you give to students interested in pursuing a career in your field, and what do you wish you knew as a student?
Don't take out any student loans. That's the biggest part of it. That's the biggest advice. If you can avoid student loans, keep talking to people. Talk to as many professionals in the field as you can. And you'll see that nobody's path is the same. So there is really no advice other than to put yourself out there, follow not necessarily what your passion is, but what your abilities are. Make sure you understand, be as honest as you can with yourself. My wife and I talk about this all the time. I always wanted to be a writer. but I'm not a writer. I don't like to read, but I love to read. But,
Yeah.
But I would love to create things like that. But what do I do every day? I don't write. I don't sit down and write. And my wife's an actor, and she's like, yeah, there's some people that they think they want to be actors, but they're really not actors. They don't, they just don't have a talent for it, and they're not being honest with themselves. So I would say that try to understand with the best of your ability, the strengths that you have. And because oftentimes you'll have a strength that you're not valuing, that you don't value, and you have this other thing that you value and you're not really strong in it. So don't lie to yourself about it. I mean, the sooner you actually embrace what you can do and what's natural for you to do, and then the sooner you can cultivate that and really build your career. So
Great. Well, thank you so much for willingness to do this.
sure.
It's been really helpful.